Okay, so this time we're going to talk about language, contact, and change, which I think is very interesting and relevant topic if we are going to be thinking about models. It's relevant for a couple reasons. One reason is because we're going to be using lots of cross-lingual transfer approaches in this class. Another reason is like knowing that language is not like when we talk about English, we're not just talking about, a single language, but we're talking about a language that's constantly evolving, constantly changing. And, same with any other language is a very important factor of multilingual NLP. It's multiple languages, even within the same thing that we're talking about. So just to give an example of this from English, which presumably everybody knows about, I have a letter from Isaac Newton from 1672, a letter from Wilbur Wright, who invented the airplane in 1899, and an email from me in 2021. Not because I think I'm on the same caliber as any of the other people here, but rather from 2021, it was just convenient to get my email. But if you look here, you can see the letter from Isaac Newton, which says, "Sir, to perform my late promise to you, I shall without further ceremony acquaint you that in the beginning of the year 1666, at which time I applied myself to the grinding of optic glasses of other figures than spherical, I procured me a triangular glass prism to try to therewith the celebrated phenomena of colors." This is, by the way, a letter to the editor of the journal. So this is what you had to write when you wanted to submit a paper in 1672. The letter from Wilbur Wright says, "Dear sirs, I have been interested in the problem of mechanical and human flight ever since as a boy I constructed a number of bats of various sizes after the style of Cayley's and Pinod's machines. My observations since have only convinced me more firmly that human flight is possible and practicable." And this is a letter from Wilbur Wright to the Smithsonian asking them for some materials. The final one is my email auto response, so much less consequential. But you'll notice actually the letter from Wilbur Wright, this doesn't seem so strange. It's like a little bit more formal than we write things nowadays, but it's pretty close to the language we speak now. It's also written in a kind of modern typeface, similar to Courier New or whatever that you see on your computer. Here from Isaac Newton, it's pretty different. Like all of the S's are kind of the old style S that looks like an F. You can see that he uses some words that we don't use very much anymore, like therewith. He also I procured me. This isn't a grammatical form that we really use anymore. So you can see that the grammar is actually changing as well. Oh, and actually it's using another letter that we don't use anymore, the A and E combined together here. So why do languages change? If you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend this book, Why Do Languages Change? And it's pretty amusing. It's about 150 pages, so it's not a heavy read. And I've learned lots of fun facts about why football is called, why soccer is called soccer in English, and the reason behind the various names of cities in Britain and stuff like this. But it has this nice categorization in the second chapter that says languages change because of changes in the world. So to give an example, the way we communicate has changed a lot. So I communicate via email, as I showed you in the previous slide. And so now we have a word email, which we didn't have 30 years ago or 40 years ago. Actually, maybe more than that. And then on the other hand, there's a word radiogram, which we don't use anymore because we don't communicate by radiogram anymore. So this word is moving out of use in the English language. And this is just one of many examples. We have new technology all the time. We have varieties of concepts that we don't use very much anymore. Another reason why languages change is laziness or efficiency. So for example, we started out with telephone and this kind of converged down to phone. This also happens in more common words like you all becoming y'all in southern US dialect, and I'm sure you can think of other things in the languages you're aware of as well. Another reason is the opposite, which is instead of being lazy and abbreviating things away, we changed things for emphasis or clarity. So one of the examples in this book is that in Old English, the pronouns in English for he, she, and they were, I'm probably going to pronounce them completely wrong, but hey, hill, and hi, or something like that. And these are too close together, so they were confusable. So they, added additional things onto them to make this more clear. And I think some of the people might have read this Gibson 2019 survey on how efficiency shapes human language. And so basically we have two pressures. We want to be lazy. We want to say things as efficiently as we can. But on the other hand, we can't say things so efficiently that everything converges into the same pronunciation in the same words, because then we couldn't communicate our thoughts. So we have this pressure of making things simpler to make it more efficient and making things more complicated to make it more clear. Another thing is politeness, and is a very interesting example of this politeness. We have this Google word list here. And this Google word list is all of the words that people in Google are not allowed to use in documentation or variable names or things like this. And just to give some examples, you're not supposed to use, you're not supposed to use agnostic, because agnostic is a name that's also used in the US for non-religious, and that might offend religious people. Another thing, I'm assuming this, sorry, don't, you can confirm with Google if that's correct, but that's my guess. You're not supposed to use the word below for some reason. Maybe it is indicative of inferiority or something like this. In general, you're not supposed to use words that are indicative of race, for example, especially if they have a negative or positive connotation. Cell phone is an Americanism, so that's they're just trying to be more clear and make it so everybody can understand and say mobile phone. Chubby, because that could be derogatory for people who are overweight or something. So you can see that there's all these things that people change the way they used to say things for politeness. Another example is misunderstanding. So the word bead apparently in English originally meant prayer, but it got mistaken because when people are from the Catholic faith, they count prayers on little balls. And when people heard this, they thought bead meant ball instead of prayer. So they started using it that way. Another thing is group identity and prestige. This is a really wonderful paper that talks about how people who belong to a certain group, in this case, forums about beer, adopt the way that people speak on that forum. And this is something called entrainment. It's a thing where you start adopting the way people speak in order to fit into the group. And in this case, the group started saying that beer had aroma, but then at some point everybody started saying smell. Maybe an influencer said smell or something like this, and then they all switched over to that. So if you're using the appropriate way of saying things, then that makes you more cool. And so you do that. And another good example of this is actually, we were talking about German and how English is a Germanic language. But actually, I don't know the actual numbers, but I think probably half or more of the words in English are from French. And the reason why is because, French people conquered England or much of England at some point. And so all of the kind of posh, like words about government and stuff like that, like constitution or election or legislation, come from French, whereas words like hand and mouth and just kind of common everyday words come from German. So there was a prestige element with saying things in French. So all of the kind of higher society words came from French. And also structural reasons, like if you adopt words from other languages, they're hard to say in that language. So you change them around and stuff like that. So basically what I want to point out here is, language is not static. We're not saying it the same way that we did before, but there's very good reasons why we're not, why we're changing the way we speak and stuff. I know that was a lot of different things. Were there any questions about these or comments? Okay, cool. So then we also have lexical changes, and these can be including things like cognates and loanwords that arise from language contact. So cognates and loanwords are two varieties of words that are shared across different languages. Cognates are words that basically start out in some sort of parent language and propagate their way into the languages just by being used over and over and over again. But they change due to the underlying phonetic changes in the language or other factors. So this is an example that I gave on the first in the first class, but I just posted it here again. This is an example of how the word to in English evolved from Proto-Indo-European. And you can see that in English, it turned into two. In German, it's something like zwei. And there are many, many other ones in everything else in the Indo-European family. And one interesting thing is words like to are so frequent that they don't, have major changes. They don't get overcome by words in other languages or things like this. So basically, like the more frequent the word is, the more likely it is to have descended from some sort of original language. And there's also interesting research, not a whole lot of it, but on like reconstruction of the original pronunciation of the word based on all of these different things. I see you nodding, yes. Another example is loanwords. So this is just one of my favorite examples. The word orchestra originally came from Greek. It was adopted into the English language just because it's a cognate. It was English descended from the same family as Greek. But that got adopted into Japanese as a loan word. And it became orchestra. So they changed the pronunciation because you need to change it in order for it to be pronounceable in Japanese. And then there was a change in the world in that we're not talking about orchestras as much, and instead we started having singing machines where it would play music for you and then you would sing. And this is called karaoke in Japanese, where kara is an original Japanese word that stands for empty, and oke is the words from orchestra. So it's basically empty orca. And then that got readapted back into English as karaoke. So it's kind of like the oke is from orchestra originally, and it came in the circular path here. So loanwords, don't always have as interesting a story as this, but very often they have to do with technology that was invented in that country. It got a name in that language, and then it gets moved back. So the orchestra was invented in Europe, got imported to Japan, and then karaoke was invented in Japan and got imported into, invented in East Asia. I'm not sure exactly where it was invented, but got re-imported back into the US. So like loanwords very often happen for precisely this reason. It's to express a concept that wasn't really around before, so it comes back. So if we look at language contact in the lexicon, this is a very good introduction of how language contact works and how it's the major driving factor behind language change. And to give just another example of this, in addition to the English example, to demonstrate that this happens all over the world, there's Swahili, which is a major language in Southeast Africa, 100 million speakers. And there was a lot of trade between 800 AD and 1920. And because of this, there was a lot of contact between Swahili-speaking places and Arabic-speaking places. And so there are estimates that say 40% of Swahili types are borrowed from Arabic, largely probably because a lot of the concepts corresponding to these types came together with trade. And this is a very, very common trend. And often it's resource-rich donor language that has lots of, economic influence in the places where the recipient language has received these. And basically, it goes both directions, obviously. It's not just like English to Japanese or Japanese to English. It goes in both ways. But the amount also, often tends to be proportional to the number of speakers and the influence. So because of this, there are now cross-lingual lexical similarities where, one language borrows words from another language, but it changes them to be pronounceable, or they change due to evolution and other things like this. And so often, one thing that you would like to do is you'd like to identify things that are, equivalent across languages and likely to be mutual translations. And this is an example of falafel, which I think also was, it was likely adopted into English, I guess, from Hebrew or Arabic, perhaps, probably Hebrew. So there's a kind of stratified lexicon structure, and the core lexicon is words that originally appeared in the language. They're words that just have been here for forever, like the word to or the word hand or something like this. There's also or beer or bread. There's also fully assimilated words for example, in English, cookie, sugar, coffee, orange. Other examples would be like election, constitution, or things like this. We don't even think that they're loanwords. And then we have partially assimilated words, and partially assimilated words are words that could be essentially, you can tell that they're foreign origin, or like you would think that they're foreign origin based on their based on just the fact that they haven't been there for very long, like a priori or something like this, or deus ex machina or something, where it's like, you have a reason to believe that they're from other languages. And then peripheral are kind of things like entities or, place names or things like this. So peripheral vocabulary are proper names and specialized terms. And very often these will have very similar or exactly the same pronunciation across many different languages. Borrowing, they might be similar. They might have similar spelling. And then you have content words in the core lexicon, like night from one ancestral language. And so in order to take advantage of this, one thing that you can do is crosslingual lexicon induction. And basically what this is identifying words that mean the same thing across different languages. And of course, this is easier if they're words of similar origin, because if they are, then the spelling could be the same, the pronunciation could be the same. This could give you hints about how which words correspond to each other. So lexicon induction, the task itself is basically, in a way, a classification task where you're given a word in a language like this Arabic word here, and you have a very large number of words in the lexicon from the other language like Hebrew, and you try to pick which one is the correct translation here. So this is obviously a hard task because, you know, any classification problem with like 100K way classification problem is going to be difficult, but you can take advantage of these kind of structural similarities to do a good job at this. So for peripheral things, especially proper names or things where we can assume that the spelling is similar, there are models of transliteration. And transliteration is essentially a problem of taking in a word in one language and trying to output the word in the other language, knowing that the only thing that differs between them is the pronunciation. So this would be an example like New York, where this is translated basically pronunciation by pronunciation into the other one. Into the other language. And there's lots of models for this. Early models for this used finite state transducers. There's also LSTMs with attention, or you know, just using a regular sequence model to solve this. But in addition to this, one of the features of transliteration is that transliteration tends to be done monotonically. So the input and the output tend to be in the same order. So there's also models that take explicit like advantage of this. So yeah, this is one task that you can do with respect to crosslingual lexicon, crosslingual lexical learning. There's with respect to, like, if you think transliteration is interesting. Oh, sorry, I forgot one important thing. So just because something's an entity doesn't mean it's just a transliteration problem. Doesn't mean that like the only thing you need to do is map the pronunciation. So just to give an example, Carnegie Mellon University, if you think about it in your language, I think it's probably likely that you don't just pronounce university unless university in your language is also pronounced similarly to university. Like, for example, in Japanese, that would be Carnegie Mellon Daigaku, where Carnegie Mellon is transliterated, but Daigaku is the Japanese version of university. So because of this, named entity translation is not just transliteration. It's a mix of transliteration and translation. That being said, there are shared tasks on named entity transliteration. And you can do things like measuring word accuracy in the top one, measure like the F score of words in the top one, or you can treat it as a transliteration mining task, where you have entities in one language and a huge list of entities in the other language and see how well you can identify entities there. And there's also downstream evaluations and things like MT and information extraction as well. So also relatively recently, there was this paper presented on a large-scale name transliteration resource with 1.6 million named entities across 180 languages. So if you're interested in entities or entity linking or anything with regards to this, you could take a look at this paper here. Cool. And then next we have cognates and loanwords. And cognates and loanwords are the ones that I talked about before. And one of the interesting things about this is there's a lot of different factors that go into what actually happens when you borrow a word. And here are two examples from the previous Arabic, or sorry, three examples from the previous Arabic and Swahili example. But you can have things like adopting the syllable structure to be appropriate for the language, Degemination, so Swahili doesn't allow consonant clusters, so it removes the consonant cluster, and vowel substitution because certain vowels are more natural here. You can also modify the morphology, apply morphology from the target language into other things like this, or adapt consonants appropriately. So what you can see is basically this is assimilating the word into the language to make it seem like natural pronunciation in the language. So there's a huge amount of linguistic research on lexical borrowing, like case studies of lexical borrowing across language pairs, what kinds of phonological, morphological phenomena happen in borrowing, case studies of sociolinguistic phenomena in borrowing, like what words tend to be borrowed, what words tend to not be borrowed, etc. And there's a fairly large number of like cognate and loanword models that do things like phonologically weighted Levenstein distance. So basically this weights likely to happen phonological substitutions to upweight ones that are more likely, like you might swap a vowel into a vowel, but not a consonant into a vowel. And other things like the ones that I listed below. And there's also similar cognate databases across 338 languages, 3.1 million cognate pairs, and 35 writing systems. So if you're interested in studying more about this, you can do this too. And there's also a lexical borrowing database, world database. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about this here, but there's also unsupervised models of lexicon induction. And basically, the way that most of these models work now is they work either as an unsupervised task of identifying lexicon items, like I talked about before, given a certain word, what are all the, what is the word in the other language that corresponds to this word? And in the unsupervised setting, what you do is you learn monolingual embeddings first. And these monolingual embeddings basically capture the either spelling or distributional characteristics of each of the words. You then find an alignment between the embedding spaces by like rotating one of the two embedding spaces to match the other one using a distributional similarity between the two aligned embedding spaces. You find nearest neighbors to induce a lexicon, and you perform supervised alignment to minimize the distance between lexical items further. So it's kind of an iterative process where you start out with an unsupervised objective, identify a few pairs with high confidence, and then perform supervised alignment. And there's a very nice extensive survey of different methods that you can use to do this here if this is of more interest. So basically, this is a method that's used to obtain bilingual dictionaries that you can then use for downstream tasks as well. Cool. So basically, that's all I have for the lecture part for today. And I talked a little bit about language contact, language change, and how this affects the lexicon. Are there any questions before we go into the discussion part? Yeah.
Would a term like laissez-faire be just directly borrowed?
Yeah, I think laissez-faire, it's something that, like, obviously English speakers, recognize as something that didn't originate in English. Like, if you ask anybody, they would know. And so I think that would say that's basically partially assimilated. A lot of people know what laissez-faire means, but they would recognize that it's something foreign, I guess. Yeah.
What NLP applications use cognate models and lexicon borrowing models?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think basically the knowing about these things could lead you to be able to create better applications. So if you think about if you think about the simplest possible way to have any sort of like lexical sharing between languages, it's train a model on lots of different languages and hope that something good happens. And that's actually what we do right now a lot of the time. So we have like a character-based model or a subword-based model, and we train it on lots of different languages, or we train it and then we do alignment here. And I think actually a lot of the stuff that I presented here was more forward-looking in that it's like, this is the way that lexical sharing actually happens in language. And there's not a whole lot of work that actually applies it in an intelligent way to doing these things. One example that I can give is a paper where we used explicit morphological and phonological embeddings to try to like do better information sharing between languages. This was back when we just used like word-to-vec embeddings or things like this. It wasn't when we used BERT or other things here. So I think you know, similar methods like this could be applied to learning like multilingual BERT or multilingual machine translation models or something like that as well. So yeah. Any other questions?